This is why I wanted to have Josiah on because what started as a simple question meant to help me distract from the fact that I had lost track of what I was going to say. Josiah has done with that question exactly what he does in the book, which is start out with the campier, more nostalgic elements of something, put it into a political, social context, and then show you how haunting and scary it is in that social context. Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another Fundy Fridays interview. I know I sound excited because I am, because like every time we have the most incredible guests. They all keep topping each other, I swear. And today we have yet another phenomenal author in the I don't know what you'd say, the deconstruction space, the avant-garde Christian literature space, whatever you want to call it. We have one of the most interesting, dynamic authors in that space today to talk with us. Josiah Hesse will be on with us to discuss his newest book, On Fire for God. And I don't even want to try to put this book into words for you all because it is everything, I would say. It is equal parts thriller, memoir, educational discussion of the history and development of American Christianity, all rolled up into one. It's impossible to parse apart unless you have the original author, which, as I said, we do today. So I'm not going to waste any time. Josiah, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me and chat about On Fire for God.
Thanks
And
for having
I
me, James.
Oh, we're so happy to. This is a little different, I'm going to tell all of you, because unlike most of the interview subjects we have on, I actually got to meet Josiah ahead of time. If you follow the Fundy Fridays Instagram, you would have seen we had a little dinner evening with Josiah, myself, and the Reverend. It was phenomenal and gave us even more stuff to talk about. But I'm not used to talking to someone I got to chat with ahead of time. So this is particularly special. Thank you again so much for coming on. And I am just going to jump us right into it, man. Tell us in your own words, what is On Fire for God? What is it as a book, as a project, and how did it come to fruition?
Thanks. Yeah, it's still a bit of a challenge for me to encapsulate it into an elevator pitch. The best way I could describe it is it's a combination of journalism and memoir that takes my story and my family's and my hometown of Mason City, Iowa, and kind of looks at the last 100 years of Christian right influence on working class families. What I would characterize as an insidious influence on poor working families. And it came about after years, really, of talking to other former evangelicals, current believers. I did a lot of interviews with people from my hometown and kind of started seeing this similar theme of shame and poverty and isolation in a lot of people. There's so much outward facing marketing going on in evangelical churches where we're encouraged to have these big smiles on our faces, live a very enviable life, ultimately to attract other people into our church and into this faith. And what I observed was a terrific amount of loneliness and shame in these people because there was such a huge disconnect between how they were behaving outwardly to the world and to each other in church and what was going on inside. And because of that, everyone thought they were the only people dealing with sin, with poverty, with doubts about the Bible, with confusion. And it never manifested into criticism of these institutions. It was always inwardly directed of I'm terrible, I'm dumb, I'm weak, and no one else is. Because in church, you look around, everyone's looking beautiful, they're smiling, they've got happy families, they drove a nice car out here, and you don't know about the fights they had on the way to church, the massive amount of debt that they're in to prop up this lifestyle. The kind of inner turmoil that I've observed in so many of them, including myself, which I go into great detail in the book. And so I really wanted to kind of pull back the curtain on this issue and give readers who maybe don't have any familiarity with this world a sort of visceral ride into my mind and body as a young person and understand what that terror and confusion and isolation feels like in a child, but then also people for who grew up in that same community that I did, in that same culture and institutions, a little bit of validation, a little bit of understanding that they weren't alone in these experiences. They weren't alone in their rapture terror or hating their bodies through purity culture and spiritual warfare, that these were secrets that we all kept inside of us.
And I want to highlight that that is one of my I have a lot of favorite things about this book. I gorged this book in 2 days. I want you all to know it was cover to cover insanely fast. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is because I say this as someone who has read and even gotten the chance to talk to a few authors in this space. Um, Discussing growing up evangelical and then kind of the deconstruction process that follows once you hit adulthood and the demons aren't quite on your doorstep the way they used to be. But I know that as someone who didn't grow up in the faith, sometimes I'm reading these books and it's just a little hard for me to catch on to. It's not my nostalgia. It's not the life I grew up in. Your book does not care whether or not you grew up in this world. It's got a story to tell you either way. I'm sure if you grew up in this particular brand of evangelical Christianity, it will feel uncomfortably and hauntingly familiar a lot of the time. But for someone like me who grew up on the outside, it was a straight gut punch. Just feeling the emotions that you went through, and with how incredibly rich the descriptions of those feelings are. It just drew me right in. And just to jump into the conversation, you already mentioned one of the things that I think really brought that out more than potentially anything else, which was the incredibly candid interviews you got with friends, family, acquaintances, all kinds of folks back from your hometown. And I also know that in the book you discuss that that's not necessarily the most comfortable process to go through. Um, so, can you tell our audience a little bit more about the process of setting up interviews with these people your own family, with old friends, knowing that you're coming back with a very different perspective on life. Tell us a little bit about what that was like, not only getting them to agree to do these interviews with you, but then actually sitting down with them and having these tough conversations for the sake of the book.
Yeah, well, it was a very cathartic experience, uncomfortable as you could imagine at a lot of times. And even though I don't think most people could relate to the experience of writing a memoir or being a journalist or interviewing their family, I think everyone can relate to cathartic moments with your family where you talk about things from the past and you learn a lot about other people's perspective and experience on things that, especially when you're a child and the world looks so big and scary and confusing, and you're learning about everything all at the same time. In my case, I was learning about like spiritual warfare at the same time I'm learning that the sky is blue. I'm learning about gravity at the same time I'm learning about Noah's Ark. So like everything is just new and fresh and mind-blowing. Um, and learning about my parents' marriage, learning about them as teenagers, as young parents. They had three kids before they were 21, and learning about what their 20s were like, which is so different from my 20s. I mean, I'm like 43 and I don't have kids, and couldn't imagine having three kids at this age, let alone at their age. But I was a kid when they were going through all this. So I have my memories of what those experiences were like, but I don't know what it was like to be an adult in those moments. And yeah, like you said, people were incredibly candid. I was very surprised at the information that people handed over, and at times felt a little unsure of myself in this context. Like the book is so critical of a lot of evangelical institutions, but then there's a certain point in the story where I'm like, am I the Music Man? Which is a popular musical. I'm sure we'll get
I'm
to
gonna
it at some
ask you
point.
about that. Don't worry.
Like,
We'll talk
am
about the Music Man, y'all.
yeah, like am I the one that's coming to town selling them a bill of goods, that's not in their best interest with doing these interviews? Because when you interview, I've been a journalist for a really long time, and if I'm interviewing a politician or a band that just put out an album or a director that just put out a movie, they're signing up for this. This is part of the gig, and they're ready for it. They have publicists. Whether they sink or swim, that's up to them, and I don't need to worry about that. But when it's my family in small town North Iowa, me coming back home and putting a microphone in their face and be like, let's talk about my childhood trauma. That's nothing they signed up for. And it was conflicting at times, and I did have to check in with them a lot in a way that you wouldn't as a journalist, if you're just interviewing someone objectively, being like, this is on the record, right? Like, I got my recorder going, like, I'm gonna put this in a book, like, you're fine with all this being out there. And they were. I mean, there were things that they're like, no, I don't want to talk about that, or I'll tell you that, but I don't want that on the record. Please don't put that in your book. And I'd be like, okay. Um, but there was so much catharsis that came out of that, so much compassion that I already had compassion for these people, but like a deeper level of compassion and understanding for their experiences that I tried to convey in the book. Like, I didn't want this to be just like a fuck you, mom and dad kind of story. Like, I wanted it to be fueled by compassion and curiosity, which are, I don't have a whole lot of ideologies or, worldviews to ground myself in, but compassion and curiosity are two things that are very important to me, and guidelines for my life and my work.
And it comes across in the book in some of the most remarkable ways. I think, in particular, you mentioned the interviews you conducted with your parents. And reading those back from an outsider perspective, it's remarkable in both directions, I would say. Both the amount of, I guess I'd say, the sheer number of demons you're kind of processing through with your parents throughout these interviews and throughout the book, which just kind of leap off the page. Obviously, there are these some very intense moments of processing and talking and healing. Hopefully, some healing there, but also side by side, and I mean sentence to sentence, you do this remarkable job of also presenting them as human beings and giving them sympathy and empathy for what they went through that led them to end up, treating you the way they did in both ways, as misguided as it was, and as much as they tried, and all the ways it did and didn't work out, um, you just balance all of that so remarkably. And I just, I guess I probably should have a question out of this. And I guess my question would be, just in particular, talking to your parents. How is it particularly strange, even beyond siblings and friends, to talk to your parents about this type of stuff? What was that particularly unique experience like for you?
I'm a very insecure person in most areas of life, but with interviews and journalism, for whatever reason, I've had a certain level of confidence. It's like a mask I can put on and play that role, and most of the time. But in this context, when I was home and doing these interviews, I found that confidence and that mask suddenly stripped away, especially being in like the home I grew up in, interviewing my mom, or just being in my hometown and remembering what it was like to be a frightened child and trying to balance, like, I'm a journalist, I have a book contract, I'm being paid to do this, I'm at work right now, this is my job, interviewing these people for this book I'm writing, and then at the same time, like, I'm having a very intimate conversation with loved ones. And there were all kinds of feelings coming and going, and it was such an exhausting process writing the book for many reasons. I mean, I went through 9 drafts writing this thing, and I had to stay present with those emotions while balancing, um, my objective as a journalist, and it was really tricky. I often thought of that Chris Farley sketch that he would do on Saturday Night Live, the Chris Farley show, where he would interview people like Paul McCartney or Jeff Daniels and be like, remember when you were in the Beatles? That was awesome. Like,
Remember when you were in the Beatles and you did that album, Abbey Road?
Hi, editing Jen here. I just wanted to add that I watched the clip that Josiah was talking about, and that's how I act in interviews. At least that's how I think I do, which is why I don't do interviews anymore. But hi, everyone. Love you.
it was those kind of moments where I was like, hey, remember when I put my arm through the window during that party? Like, remember that? Like, I I don't have a question here, but like, you remember that? Like, I was like fumbling through a lot of things where I'm like, I don't know how to like give a pointed question like I would to a politician, where I don't really care about their feelings or their career or how they're going to react to this, but I've got a lot on my shoulders doing these interviews with my parents.
Absolutely. And you see that just because you even do such a good job of discussing like kind of how that mask that professionalism starts to slip or break down a little bit. It just becomes so incredibly difficult to navigate. And I know you mentioned that in the book that there are times where the conversations got a little more heated than they probably would with what you maybe would call a normal subject, like the politician you were talking about. You can get mad at me all you want. I also don't have any personal feelings about you, but when it's my mom, my dad, like it's just that doesn't happen. And over time things change. It read the book, especially if you've I I was blessed. I didn't particularly, I was not treated by my parents the same way. Um, but for people who have gone through this kind of evangelical upbringing, I suspect this will be both very difficult, but also very rewarding. And for those of you who are like me, we need to see how these little babies, these little Christian evangelical babies live. It's so tough for you all. My word.
This is something I've noticed with James recently. He keeps saying little babies, and people don't know what he's talking about. He's referencing the way that Jerry Falwell would always say, little babies.
Throwing God, or successfully, with the help of the federal court system, throwing God out of the public square, out of the schools. The abortionists have got to bear some burden for this, because God will not be mocked, and when we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
So anyway, I'm going to move off of your family because if you read the book, you'll know he's done plenty of processing that as it is already. And instead, I want to talk a little bit about the setting of the book and Iowa, but also specifically Mason City, Iowa, and most specifically ties to a very particular musical that also features heavily throughout the book. I know it's weird to say a musical's featured heavily throughout the book, but I swear I actually mean it this time. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so my hometown was the setting for The Music Man. This man, Meredith Willson, wrote it about his hometown. He grew up in Mason City. It's set at the early 20th century. And it was something we all knew about, and the town is obsessed with it. It's their one claim to fame. The other hometown I grew up in right next door is Clear Lake, Iowa, which their claim to fame is killing Buddy Holly. Ultimately, him and Richie Valens died in a plane crash after playing a concert there. And in Mason City, like Music Man is everywhere. You go to the Hardee's and it's like a Music Man museum. There's like instruments and uniforms everywhere. But the story is there's a traveling salesman who's been going from town to town selling the ruse of a boys' band that's going to cure all the social worries of your town, all the worries about morality and licentious behavior. But meanwhile, he's a very licentious person, and he doesn't know anything about music. He doesn't know how to play the instruments. He doesn't know anything about a marching band, but he gets these towns worked up, afraid of something. He has a different one for each town. And once they're all freaked out about that thing, he's like, you know what the answer is? You need this boys' band. You need this traditional vestige of the past that is going to ground your children in the rich traditions of your grandparents. We're gonna make them great again, ultimately. And I grew up loving the musical. Great songs, great performances, wonderful story. But when I started writing about televangelists and political hucksters, I realized, like, wow, there are so many parallels between the Music Man and the history of the Christian right. He finds the when he first comes to town, he finds his friend Buddy Hackett, and he's like, what's going on with this town? What kind of trouble are they in?" And Buddy Hackett's like, "River City's not in any trouble." And he's like, "Well, then we're gonna have to create some."
If I'm going to get your town out of the serious trouble it's in,
River City ain't in any trouble.
we're going to have to create some. Must create a desperate need in your town for a boys' band.
It's like, we need a desperate need for a boys' band in your town. And he sees that the pool table, a pool table is just being installed down the road, and everyone's looking in the windows. They're excited about it. And he's like, they've never seen a pool table before. He's like, no, they don't know what this is. And he's like, there we go. And he goes into town and he's like, let me tell you, good people of River City, like Meredith Wilson changed the name from Mason City to River City. He's like, when this pool table comes to town, like, your sons are going to be gamblers and your daughters are going to be whores, and there's going to be ragtime music. And he's got this subtle racism in there with it's going to grab your daughters with the arms of a jungle animal instinct, mass hysteria. And
It'll grab your son, your daughter, with the arms of a jungle animal instinct.
It's the same playbook that we've seen again and again throughout history. When the Klan came to my hometown in the 20s and they had a big parade and were recruiting all these people, it was like jazz music is coming to town. There was a lot of people of color coming to town because there were these quarries, and they were finding things that they could stir up trouble with, and then sell people these uniforms and the membership to the Klan, and bilk their money. And you see this again and again throughout history. If it's the Red Scare, if it's women voting, or the Satanic Panic, gay marriage. Today it's trans people. Politicians and televangelists will always find what people are unsure about, whatever's new in culture and technology, in gender or sexuality, and be like, this is going to destroy everything. If we allow gay marriage to happen, like, people are going to be fucking animals in the streets, and it's going to be pedophilia, and just blowing up whatever unease there is about changing social mores. And I started seeing parallel with all of these characters as well. Jerry Falwell, Billy Graham, Billy Sunday, to go all the way back to the 20s, who partnered with the Klan on a lot of campaigns, and Trump himself, like both Harold Hill, the Music Man, and Trump they claim to be geniuses. Trump is a business genius, he's a government genius, and Hill is a music genius. Well, neither of them were geniuses in these fields, but where they are geniuses is marketing. Like Trump is a marketing genius. I will give him that. He knows how to tap into the unease people are feeling about how things are changing and how to exploit that and how to offer a nice solution that harkens to the past. You see that again and again throughout history. Songs like Old Time Religion, and like the Klan was obsessed with the 1890s. Jerry Falwell was obsessed with the 1930s. Reagan was obsessed with the 1950s. And Trump, it's this vague part of the past to make America great again. Like they're all pointing to generations past, like 40, 50, 60 years ago. Like that was the time that we had it all figured out. And I'm going to take you back there if you just follow me and sign up for my boys band or, vote for the MAGA movement.
And just for those who might be a little curious about the Music Man, it is also, I learned from you, Josiah, that the Music Man was the inspiration for the famous monorail episode of The Simpsons. So if you've seen that, you kind of get an idea too.
Wow. And now that I've seen the movie, I can recognize the Music Man everywhere. And if you recall a very old episode of Family Guy, when Pieter is playing for the Patriots, he sings the Shapoopy song, and that is from this musical.
But not to get too unserious with it, because I think the points you make there are incredible. That throughout this book, obviously Mason City's history with the Music Man was already something rich to build off of, but the ability you have to just weave that through this kind of consistent moral panic, and how I love the bit of a spoiler alert, but the fact that the pool table is referenced for basically whatever new social ill is coming up at whatever time in the book you're writing about. It's just this remarkable allegory to see play out. And with that in mind, I want to highlight another thing that I really love about On Fire for God, which is I mentioned at the top of the interview. Through all of the gut-wrenching realism of the interviews, and through the very thoughtful, insightful, well-researched discussions of American history and how it relates to that region and what was happening there. Third layer to this, and it was the one that really captured me the most, and which I'd never seen before, and I'm now craving a lot more of, which was the horror element of this book. And I mean that very legitimately, to all of our viewers out there. This book reads like a very scary thriller. On top of all of this, if you're not being educated about American life, or dissecting religion, or feeling a whole mixed bag of emotions for Josiah and his entire family, you're going to spend other parts of the book absolutely terrified. And I want to talk to you a little bit about your horror influences, because it just, again, not to keep using this phrase, but it really leapt off the page. I'll probably ask about her a little bit, but there's a demon that follows you throughout the entire book. There are some segments that just are absolutely gripping in that regard, and just fearful. So what are some of the influences you brought, maybe authors or media that you've liked, or I guess I would even just take it a step back and say, how were you able to infuse all of that layer of storytelling in a book that was otherwise so grounded in reality?
Yeah, well, that was a tricky process. A lot of times, I mean, like I said, I went through 9 drafts of this thing, and I think the 6th draft was something like 900 pages, because I was just getting really excited about exploring all these subjects in depth, and had to like scale it back. And a lot of times it felt like a Rubik's Cube, where you're like, oh, I need this piece to go over here, but then when I do that, this piece over here is going to go the wrong way that I need it. And, finding the balance between reporting on these larger historical topics and having a very intimate, gripping story about this frightened child took a lot of finesse. And biggest influence on me in that regard, and maybe it's cliche to say, but is Stephen King. I grew up a massive Stephen King fan, still am to this day. After I'm done with this interview, I'm gonna jump back into reading it for the, I don't know, eighth time. Um, and he has a formula. I mean, he has several formulas throughout his books, but they're very clean structurally. They get you to fall in love with these characters, and then he, manipulates the reader in that way where you're hoping for something to happen and it doesn't, or when it does, you're thrilled. And the Caldonia demon that you mentioned was a kind of witch old hag character that was with me throughout my childhood, was in my dreams, was in my head. I would have moments of like seeing her when I entered a room. I mean, just very briefly, I wasn't like a schizophrenic. I didn't have like audio or visual hallucinations exactly, but it was something that was with me more than the voice of my parents or siblings or friends. Like that was my most consistent companion when I was a kid. And the culture that I grew up in was very influenced by horror movies. It's something people don't talk about all that often, and it really surprises me. But, we grew up reading Frank Peretti novels, This Present Darkness, which were very influenced by Stephen King. We put on Hell Houses, which are haunted houses with a kind of Christian message.
He thought his homosexual lifestyle was everything a real man could want. But now he's dying of AIDS. Steve.
Passion plays, which are very violent for anyone who's seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. These are very scary institutions, and they borrowed from horror movies of the 70s and 80s, things like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist. And those movies were very influenced by Catholic aesthetics, going back centuries. So there was this kind of mimicry going on between horror writers and filmmakers and Christian institutions that I'm surprised just doesn't come up in conversation more often. And when you watch horror movies, most of them, like the older ones, well, and the newer ones, like the Conjuring series, that could be straight out of an evangelical youth group. I mean, they're great movies in terms of cinema, but they're Christian propaganda as far as I'm concerned. The characters that they're based on are people that, the Warrens are people who kind of made this idea of supernatural warfare part of mainstream society. They're the ones that gave us the Amityville Horror. And so when I watch these movies, I'm like, oh, okay, there's a liberal character who's always very skeptical of the supernatural realm, but this liberal character is eventually either killed or, says like, oh, I was wrong, this is real, oh my God. Uh, and in slasher movies, people who have sex or do drugs are always killed very quickly. So horror movies, to me, a great deal of them are Christian propaganda and could be sold at Christian bookstores, as far as I'm concerned. But it was something that was with me throughout my childhood, and had a huge influence on my worldview and my aesthetic sensibility when it came time to be a writer. I really gravitated towards scary stories, and still watch horror movies almost every day now as a middle-aged adult. So it's something that I'm just fascinated by, but also immersed in, and is just part of my worldview, thanks to growing up evangelical.
Popping in again to say that if this sounds interesting to you, Josiah has actually written horror novels, so go check those out.
Well, I want you all to know watching that I had a question and then it poofed out of my brain. So instead, I'm going to ask one that was put on the sheet here specifically, more to be a little playful. Speaking of Christian multimedia, can you give us your thoughts on Christian megastar Carman?
Oh, where to begin? Well, first of all, I'm very sad that I didn't get a chance to really unpack Carmen in the book. He's mentioned a couple of times, but he was as big an influence on me as any youth pastor or church camp speaker. Carman was a Christian pop star in the 80s and 90s. I mean, into the 2000s. He became a big Trump supporter later in life. He died of cancer a few years back. But he was the first like pop star that I had a connection with when I was, I don't know, probably like 3 or 4 years old in my parents' LP collection. His album Coming On Strong was like the first piece of music that I really got lost in, like sitting in front of my parents' massive stereo system, playing on vinyl and looking at the cover and then meeting him, getting his autograph. It was the first concert I went to. But his music is something that's very distinctly Carmen and yet not really groundbreaking or original in any way. He does rap, he does rock in this very like middle-aged white guy kind of way. His songs are very catchy, but there's always this theme of basically Christian nationalism.
Somewhere between the red, the white, and blue is me and you.
It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped.
That America was founded as a Christian nation, that God has a plan for us, that in the spiritual realm, there's a fight for the soul of America, for our schools, for the media, for government, that we're on this battlefield. And as a kid, I had painted on my wall the words "God's got an army," which was a song of Carmen's, where it's very militaristic, obviously from the title. It talks about like how we all need to be soldiers in the army of the Lord, and this was stuff that gets into you at a young age because it is so catchy. These are very well crafted pop songs, but they're also very visceral and at times terrifying. There was more of that horror element in a lot of Carmen's music videos. I'd encourage anyone to look up Carmen Revival in the Land or Witch's Invitation to see some of those scarier elements of his. He does like a kind of storytelling in a lot of his songs. There's like a speaking part and a singing part, often a rapping part. The song "Who's in the House," I think is the title.
We're familiar with that one around here.
Yeah, that's a real earworm.
Tell me who's in the house. Tell me who's in the house.
If you listen to it, it will be ringing in your head for days to come. But there was a very insidious, politically charged narrative within all of his music. I would say he was the most effective messenger of the Christian right, even more than DC Talk or Jerry Falwell or perhaps even Billy Graham. I mean, they're generations apart, but for my generation, I don't think anyone shaped our Christian worldview and our aesthetic sensibility like Carmen did.
See, this is why I wanted to have Josiah on, because what started as a simple question meant to help me distract from the fact that I had lost track of what I was going to say. Josiah has done with that question exactly what he does in the book, which is start out with the campier, more nostalgic elements of something, put it into a political, social context, and then show you how haunting and scary it is in that social context. And you're able to do that so effectively. I also did remember what I was going to say, by the way, and I'm going to mention it now just because it wasn't actually a question, it's a plug for your book. But we wanted to make sure to let people know that specifically for the audiobook recording of this, Josiah not only recorded the audiobook himself, but tapping into those horror influences, I was told that you utilized. Now, I read the book in paper, Jen listened to it on audio because we like to tag team here, but I was told you use some quite effective, scary voices in the audiobook. So we want to direct everyone who is interested in a really visceral, scary time to check out the audiobook in particular. After you've bought it in paper, of course, make sure to check out the audiobook as well. The political themes here are very layered as well. It's not just one particular thing, but again, this book really shows how evangelical Christianity, especially in a place like rural Iowa at the time you were growing up, is kind of like an octopus. It finds its way into everything. It gets its little tentacles on everything. And I think one of the ways that that gets addressed most directly in the book, at least in my opinion, was through the lens of poverty and how Christianity oftentimes is kind of a response or maybe an exploitative measure when in a place where poverty is present. Um, and so I say that because, like, in the book, you discuss how this evangelical prosperity gospel that relied on seed faith and tithing as much as you possibly could was in these communities that were not wealthy to begin with and struggling even more than usual at the time that you were growing up. Um, and you had people who were, I mean, you talk about in the book, had multiple jobs while also trying to do night school and service work, trying to just pay the bills and improve their station while also getting in good with God and all of this. And it was just exhausting. And so my question to you, as someone who not only lived through it, but has come out the other side of that evangelical upbringing with so much thought and so much careful consideration and social context, do you think, or how much, I guess, would you say, I know it is to a certain extent, but how much would you say this kind of apocalyptic fire and brimstone prosperity gospel is a response to the powerlessness of an impoverished life in a place like, rural Iowa during the farm crisis?
Yeah, well, and it's popular anywhere that people are in a state of desperation. Prosperity gospel. It's often taken to developing nations with traveling preachers, and wherever people are really desperate, they're going to be drawn to these answers of very quick wealth. There was a lot of materialism in prosperity gospel when I was a kid. A lot of preachers who would brag about the homes they lived in, the cars they drove, the expensive vacations they took, the expensive suits that they wore, and this would be evidence in their narrative of God's blessing. And it wasn't until I was like 17 or so where I was like, did God bless you with those things, or did we bless you with those things? Because yes, prosperity gospel seems to work out very, very well for you up there, but the rest of us are still shopping at thrift stores and clipping coupons and struggling to, pay the bills. Um, and this is something that's been going on for a long time. I'll mention this briefly. I talk in the book about the Protestant work ethic, which came about in the Calvinist age, where, like, if you enjoy hard work, you're more likely to be part of the chosen who are predestined for heaven. And during the Jamestown colonies in early, it wasn't America yet, but in those colonies, they would, use this idea of, like, not only do you work hard, but you're joyful in working hard will, get you into heaven. And with my community, there was this farming crisis in the 1980s where all these farms were going bankrupt. All these people were losing their family farms that they'd had going back 100 years, and they were eventually bought up by these large corporations. And the whole idea of the family farm is pretty much non-existent now in the Midwest. There are some of them, but they're usually quite large, and they look nothing like they did generations ago. But suffice it to say, you had a lot of people in a desperate place, and you had these preachers saying, on top of your tithe of 10%, beyond that, you have seed faith offerings to God that you will get a tenfold return on. And the more dangerous you were in your giving, the more sign of a faith that you were exhibiting, not unlike snake handling, honestly. I mean, that is the whole premise of snake handling is like, I'm going to show all of you and the Lord how much I believe in this shit by holding venomous snakes in my hand and knowing that God is going to protect me. So if you're giving all you have to the church, and on top of that, you're also like giving free labor. Like I helped put the roof on our church with some other people, and did free detasseling corn as fundraisers. My mom worked in the daycare for free, and so you're giving, giving, giving to the church. But the more it hurts, the more sign of a faith you're exhibiting, and the greater return that you're going to have. And my parents, they had as two small businesses. It was very 80s. It was a tanning bed salon and water beds. And they were doing okay, but they were giving so much money to the church. A lot of these businesses ended up folding. And my dad estimated that over the course of under a decade, he gave $250,000 to our church. And when I think about how we grew up and how much we struggled and how I didn't go to college. My brother and sister went to 2-year community colleges. I was like, you could have taken that money and dropped it in the stock market, invested in damn near anything and had a nice little cushion for your family. But it was all like grand. That's why evangelicals love Trump so much. He speaks that same language of like the best or the worst, the most evil, the greatest riches you've ever seen. Nobody's seen anything like this. It was that kind of rhetoric coming to the church. Like, you're going to be taking expensive vacations. You're going to have a boat on the lake. It's going to be amazing. I mean, when we would have settled for like security, you have enough in the bank to pay your bills. You've got a little stocked away for a rainy day. Like that would have been prosperity for us. But instead, it was very materialistic. And to tie it back to the Music Man, he has this thing, Professor Harold Hill, called the think system, when the boys in the marching band get all their instruments and they look to him like, how do we play this trombone, this trumpet, these drums? And he's like, you don't touch the instruments. You think about it. You imagine yourself playing those instruments, and when the time comes, you will know what to do. And by that time, he skipped town. But that was the whole thing. It's like the think system. You visualize yourself doing it. And we were taught to like visualize the prosperity that was going to come to us if we invest our seed faith offering in the prosperity gospel of our church. And it was very much like dissuading you from any kind of doubt, any kind of negativity. And if you don't see the prosperity, if you don't reap this tenfold harvest, it was probably because you were sowing a seed of doubt. You were questioning the church. You were questioning your pastor. You were questioning the think system. And so there was never any moment where you're like, hey, wait a minute. Like, I've given you all this money. I've never seen a tenfold return on it, because like you would never be so bold as to say that, because the narrative coming back at you would be like, well, what did you do wrong? Like what sin in your life was keeping you from God's reward? What doubt in your heart and in your mind, which were perfectly reasonable things to be feeling and thinking, that must be the culprit that kept you from the riches that I'm enjoying up here as the pastor. Like, look at me, it's working out great. Like, I don't know what you're up to in your private life.
See, and I wanted to ask you this because I read about it recently and I thought of you when I read about this. I'm curious about your thoughts now that I don't know if you've heard, but like Pieter Thiel, I'm sure you're familiar, is now giving strange apocalyptic sermons, private sermons to other billionaires talking about how the Antichrist is coming back or something. How does it feel to know that this tradition is now being co-opted by billionaires? Why do you think they're worried about it?
I don't know if they are legitimately worried about it. I know that it's a racket that works out very well for them, because if you think about it, trickle-down economics is just like the think system and prosperity gospel. Like, you're kind of sold this idea of like, just give more, give more tax breaks to the wealthy, and you will reap a tenfold harvest on that, or in the case of my town, replacing all of our retail restaurant businesses and farms with like big corporate chains. Let us come in and run things, and you'll see all this economic prosperity, and your kids will want to stay in town, and it'll give cultural legitimacy to your bumpkin community. And that never transpired into anything fruitful for anyone in the Midwest. I think Peter Thiel is working within a tradition of wealthy industrialists using religion to manipulate people through fear or promises of wealth. Peter Thiel's big thing is the Antichrist, and that's a game that works very well if you get people freaked out about the end of the world. There were a lot of people in the 70s, including Bob Dylan, part of this thing called the Jesus movement, that were so convinced that they were, 5 years, 8 years away from the end of the world, that people weren't saving for retirement. They weren't thinking they had decades ahead of them. They would give all their money to the church. And meanwhile, this guy, Hal Lindsey, who wrote this book that they all read, The Late Great Planet Earth, he was taking all that money and he was investing it in real estate. So obviously he didn't believe that the world was about to burn in a couple of years, because he was putting down investments that paid off very well for him in generations to come.
I was curious about that because I even wrote on my little sheet here. You talk a lot about Pastor Jim in the book, and that he's where that $250,000 went to. How do you think these people sleep at night? Do you think that they do you think that these types of folks actually believe in the hell they preach and have just deluded themselves into thinking that the work they do is good enough, or do they just put out of the mind the fact that they're taking food out of children's mouths and education out of their brains? Like, how do these people deal with themselves? How do you think?
I wonder about that a lot, and it's something I stop short of having any certainty on. I just watched this very interesting interview with Christopher Hitchens in like, I don't know, 2007 or something, talking about the death of Jerry Falwell. And he was saying like, Anderson Cooper asked him like, "Do you think Falwell really believed in all the stuff he's preaching?" He's like, "Of course not. It was all bullshit. Him, Pat Robertson, Billy Graham, they're all charlatans, and they know it, and they're laughing all the way to the bank." And I was like, I don't feel so certain in that, because I know what it is to be a believer and to orient yourself around this. And I know in my community, we all were believers, and many of them still are. And I could imagine that a lot of people putting this stuff out into the world do believe that they're doing good, or they certainly have an incentive to believe in it. What was it Upton Sinclair who said it's very difficult to convince a man of something when his paycheck depends on him not understanding it? uh like corporations that could learn about the pollution that they're putting into the world, the contributions they're making to climate change, but it's quite convenient for them to not believe it, to believe the anti-climate change rhetoric. So I think there's so much wiggle room in your head for what you can and need to believe. So I can't say for certain either way. If they were like, "Ooh, I'm gonna sucker these people into giving me all their money and they're a bunch of dupes, and I'm gonna just laugh my way to the bank." I think that's certainly possible, and I think there are examples of that in history, but I think you can do really horrible things to other people and believe that you're doing good, that you're on the side of good, and delude yourself into believing that.
What made it so easy for people to ignore, like, the camel going through the eye of the needle and the braiding the whip and flipping the tables. What makes it so easy for that part of this religion to be ignored, do you think? Because that's a question I have been posing to a lot of people recently. How does this keep getting passed over like it's not a problem?
I'm I'll give a plug to a friend of mine's book, Blake Chastain's Exvangelical and Beyond, which I'm in the middle of reading. He's the one who came up with the term exvangelical. It's the name of his podcast. And he does an excellent job of mapping the trajectory of evangelical culture and theology throughout America. And he talks about how a lot of evangelical theologians, not academics, not people who went to seminary or anything, people who created their own Christian colleges, but in the 19th and early 20th century, kind of had this wiggle room with the Bible. I mean, the Bible is such a vast, complicated, contradictory mess of poems and legal documents and historical records. And, anything you want to justify, you can find in the Bible to justify. And so there were a lot of evangelicals who loved the angry God of the Old Testament and loved the kind of incel rhetoric of Paul in his letters in the New Testament, and kind of skip over the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, which are often like pacifist and socialist, you could argue, and not kind to rich people. I mean, Jesus says it many times. A rich man came to Jesus and asked, "How do I get into heaven?" And he said, "Sell everything you own and give it to the poor." Like a pretty direct, clear statement. And then later on, he says the thing about like, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He's not really speaking all that vaguely on this issue, but there were theologians who looked at that and believed and taught that that applies to the kingdom of heaven. That is not about the present day. Paul's instructions to the Thessalonians, the Corinthians, like those were about instructions on how to live a moral life today. And Jesus was speaking about the kingdom of heaven, which will come one day, but not today. And we don't need to worry about that right now. And so let's not really trouble our heads about that. So, I mean, it's like I said, it's such a big mess. Like it makes the US Constitution look like a Hemingway sentence. The Bible. That's why like whenever you have social issues throughout American history, be it slavery, the civil rights movement, you have people on both sides of that using the Bible and Christianity to justify their position. And you can find things in the Bible that will justify slavery, that will through a certain interpretation, view Black people as inferior. But you could also use the Bible to fight slavery. Like the abolition movement was very Christian. The civil rights movement with Martin Luther King was very Christian. That was the Christian progressive movement, and they had their scriptures to justify their perspectives and their beliefs. So really, like it's like a Rorschach test. Like you really just see in the Bible what you want to see in it.
And ironically, that is another theme I've noticed in the book that you discuss really well, is kind of the shifting relationship that a person can have to their Christianity, depending on what part of their life they're at, or what stage they're at, or even what they're doing at any given moment. And I know, like, for example, you talked about, and I've heard this from a lot of deconstructed evangelicals that I've spoken to, but the good memories of church camp are things like air hockey and ping pong. And anybody who remembers the terrifying biblical sermons that were part of it is either probably very Christian today and looks back on it fondly, or is trying to forget and progress beyond that. So I say that to just ask, and this is something I've asked other people we've interviewed before too, but are there any parts of for all of the trauma that's discussed in the book that we've even discussed up to this point, for all of those difficult parts of your Christian upbringing, are there some parts of it that you appreciate now for what, the person you become, I guess I would say?
There's a lot of teachings of Jesus that still resonate with me today in now 2026. pacifism is something that has always intrigued me. When Jesus said, I think it was to Peter, who just offended Jesus by cutting off the ear of the Roman soldier. He said, like, put your knife away. He who lives by the sword will die by the sword. If a man, steals your hat or steals your shirt, give him your hat and cloak as well. Turn the other cheek. These are things that really resonated with me as a child and continue to this day to resonate in my heart. Having compassion for people who are persecuting you. And I know these are things that were also weaponized, say, against slaves, like or during the civil rights movement, like don't stir things up, like don't make trouble for people, like be meek and quiet. And so I know they have an insidious history with them. But there's also beauty in the Song of Solomon. There's great storytelling, great poetry in the Bible. Um, I learned about pop music and rock music through these institutions. I mean, as a kid, I didn't know that punk and ska weren't evangelical institutions. Like, I thought, like, when I discovered, say, like Mustard Plug or Less Than Jake, I was like, there are secular bands that sound like this, or like hearing Green Day, I'm like, well, they sound like MXPX.
This is just a message for Josiah. We didn't get to talk about this in person, but I read the part in the book about Green Day, and I just wanted to say that Green Day is my favorite band, and I could talk about them for hours. So anyway, hi everybody.
Like, I didn't know that like punk rock actually had this rich history. Well, rich, going back to the 70s. And that is a whole other conversation that kind of, you know, led to my deconstruction. But yeah, there were so many wonderful memories of being immersed in these institutions, and those are things that I still carry with me. I can still listen to that music. I did a very harrowing story about Michael Tate from DC Talk, who was drugging and raping young men. It was absolutely horrifying writing that story, but I was listening to DC Talk the whole time, and I was still like, these are bangers. Like, God's Not Dead is a jam. Like, the chord changes in there. It's great music. I mean, that's been used in a very insidious way. But yeah, like there's so much, and horror. Like I was saying before, like I was introduced to the genre of horror through evangelical media and rhetoric, and that's a huge part of my life today.
And I think that it's interesting you bring up that particularly like the rebellion element of like Christianity and how it related to you and punk music and ska music and how it was so easy for you to see those as just Christian genres because it tied so well into that message. And I say all of that to highlight that another major theme of the book, at least as I saw it as an outside reader, was the your own personal rebellion, specifically as a queer youth, going through all of this while also trying to figure out your own sexuality and how it fits into all of that. And I would argue that some of the most harrowing moments of the book were discussions of how those things interacted with each other. I wanted to say, first of all, one of my favorite scenes in the book is you juxtaposing your expressions and explorations of femininity with the guys from Strike Force. And if you're not familiar, Strike Force, there's other ones like it. Power Team is the one I knew of, but Christian muscle men, basically. Rip a phone book in half, pray with the kids, roll up a frying pan, tell them about hell. And all of that is running side by side as you're secretly putting on, high-heeled shoes and enjoying braids in your hair, which is made particularly incredible by the fact that it's your own story. So with that in mind, could you tell us a little bit more about, because we haven't even talked about that yet necessarily, how your queer identity existed or the development of your identity was part of all of this and how it was kind of yet another gust of wind in this hurricane, I guess you could say.
And that was something I kind of had to explore as I was writing the book, remembering these experiences, and that juxtaposition of discovering what was authentically inside of me and how that was uh, framed in the world that I grew up in, which was as evil, as an example of supernatural warfare. The idea that there are angels and demons around us, and they're trying to, war for our souls through our minds and bodies, our thoughts. Like I couldn't trust my own thoughts. I couldn't trust my own body, particularly when I was going through puberty. And I was attracted to both boys and girls and viewed the heterosexual side of me as the holy side and the homosexual side of me as the evidence of Satan. And there were a lot of chick tracks, if anyone remembers those, that reinforced that worldview. And I think a lot of people can relate to like being a kid and not just queer or feminine people, but just like being playful with how you dress and how you move and how you speak, and not really having that self-awareness that comes with puberty, where people are going to call you a fag and punch you in the back of the head if you step out of line. That's something I think people even outside of this institution can relate to. And to take it back to Strike Force. Masculinity has always been portrayed in evangelical circles as evidence of holiness. Billy Sunday talked about this, and Billy Graham was, a very tall, masculine, deep-voiced guy, and you can look at Mark Driscoll.
I don't think there's anything purer than two guys in a cage, no balls, no sticks, no bats, no help, no team, and just see which man is better. And as a pastor and as a Bible teacher, I think that God made men masculine. He made humanity male and female. And men and women are different. Not that one is good and the other's bad. That's why I married a woman. I'm very glad to be married to her. But I think men are made for combat. Men are made for conflict. Men are made for dominion. And it doesn't matter what you do to a bunch of guys. I mean, you could put them in the worst public high school and tell them that they need to just, be into their feelings and talk about their feelings and cry a lot and finger paint their inner life. And at the end of the day, they're still going to want to throw down. And when they go to recess, two guys are going to go at it and see which one is the dude. And that's just the way men are made. So we either allow that in a way that is violent and inappropriate, which is what a lot of guys do through criminal activity, or we put it together as a viable, legitimate sport and let men be men and do what men do, and let the other fat, lazy men sit around and criticize them while watching.
There are all these characters who, frame not just like conventional manliness, but like exhibitionist manliness as like evidence of your righteousness. And Strike Force would like, break bricks with their hands, flaming bricks, or chunks of ice, or they'd be laid between like beds of nails and have like five guys on top of them, and then they break bricks with a sledgehammer on top of some guy's chest. And I did love it. It was a great show, but like they would tie it into the message of the Lord, and they would also talk about like how gay people are pedophiles, and you need to watch out for them. And like this is evidence of demons inside of you if you find yourself behaving this way. And I just kind of dumbly, naively enjoyed putting on my mother's pearls, putting on dresses, high heels, and walking around. And then I would have this rhetoric coming at me and being like, oh, this is me inviting demons into my body, and then finding evidence of that when I would have this like sexual awakening during puberty. So it was very confusing and shaped me in this fundamental way that very much is still with me to this day. Like I don't believe in these things anymore. I am an atheist. I don't literally fear a demonic influence in my bedroom, in my life, in my body, but the fear is still there. The reaction to sexual energy is still in me, and I'm still afraid of the dark. Like I sleep with electric candles all over my bedroom. It's still in my body. There's a very popular book called The Body Keeps the Score. That's about how trauma lives in the body. And I think a lot of evangelicals who had those same experiences can relate to these things shaping you in a way that you're never going to completely shake, even if you don't believe in it anymore. It's still, I mean, I don't want to say for everyone, like this is what everyone's experience is. I don't know that, but I do suspect that, and I've heard that from other people. And I know that for me, like I'm still, when I'll wear a dress today as a man in my 40s, and 89, 95% of me will absolutely love it and think it's fantastic. Let's go out dancing. And then there'll be like a little part of me that's like, bag, loser, like there's like this insidious little voice that's still inside of me, and it's something that I still have to contend with.
And I want to tell you, not to tell too many scenes from the book, but I just had to say this because there was one part of your entire book that made me cry. I think partially because I read it so fast, I was just processing everything um, too quickly to like actually feel my emotions. But there was a scene in the book that particularly hit me when you were, and I would consider it part of the gender exploration, which was the party at your home with other Christian kids, and bless your little heart, they were so mean to you, and all you wanted to do was be a good host. And I when you brought up I'm not going to tell you all exactly, but when you mentioned the Atari, I had to stop and put the book down for a moment and cry it out a little bit and then come back to it. And I am curious because it did seem like in that scene though that you found or discovered maybe one of your earliest, I don't know if you would say, but more feminine appreciations was hosting. I hope they didn't take that away from you. Do you still enjoy hosting? Do you still enjoy having people over and stuff like that?
Absolutely. I love hosting and I love domestic work. Like I would have made such a great traditional housewife. I don't really care for kids that much, but I love cleaning, cooking, having people over, making people comfortable, putting on music or movies that I think fit with the crowd, filling up people's drinks. And those were the kind of gender expectations that didn't really fit for me as a kid, and not just with me, with my family as well, because I talk about my mom a fair amount in the book, and she admittedly was crap at these things. And I don't say that with any malice because she was a genius in so many other areas of her life. She excelled academically. She had plans to be a diplomat, to go work in the State Department, ended up having kids, but later on, when she pulled herself out of a whole mess of poverty and abuse and trauma, she went back to school and developed amazing business skills, and has a brilliant mind that has found a place in the world. But as a woman in Pentecostal Christianity, her value to that culture, to that community, was having babies, keeping a home, keeping the husband happy, and hosting parties. And she didn't want to do any of that. I wanted to do all of it. And so did my dad. Like maybe not so much the hosting stuff, but he has always loved cleaning. And he taught me so much about cleaning and dishes and cooking. Like I got all of my domestic skills from my father. So none of us really fit this mold that the culture was trying to shove us into, and felt a lot of shame and self-loathing over that. But yeah, to this day, I absolutely love hosting dinner parties or movie nights and cleaning. Like that's my safe place. Like when I'm stressed out over writing and work and stuff, like let's go vacuum, let's go do the dishes, let's clean the windows, and I'll go to other people's houses and do that as well. And it like calms my nervous system.
I need you to know how important that answer was to my mental health because I
Hmm.
swear I have been focusing. It's that scene has lived in the back of my mind, and I'm like, if those boys took this away from him, I swear to God, it means a lot to me, and I hope it means a lot to you all too, because this is what we talk about when we say things do get better on the other side. You get to have all that stuff back. Um, I do think it's interesting though you bring up not well going back to your family a little bit. Um, I thought it was interesting because I saw some of the way you just talked about your parents now is very similar to how you talk about them in the book, and I thought it was really interesting because it I think showed some of that gender dichotomy and that family dichotomy where even though reading the book, and I would suspect for most of our audience here today, any of you who all read the book, not to put one side on the other, but I think the reactions from an outside reader would probably be a little bit angrier towards your father just because of the things that happened and the way he approached the family, and the things he did to kind of contribute to all of that trauma. Not to be comparative necessarily, but just having been on the outside, if I have to pick a villain, well, it's Caldonia the demon. But if I have to pick someone who I thought was more at fault, it would, from an outsider's perspective, feel more like your dad. But at the same time, it seemed easier to address things and express your anger about these things with your mother, which meant that in the discussions that it sounded like they almost got a little more heated with her. Would you agree with that? And do you think that maybe like family structure and those gender roles played into that dynamic to a certain extent?
I think there were more unresolved issues between me and my mom than there were with me and my dad. Me and my dad became really good friends in my 20s and remain so to this day. There are problematic aspects of our father-son relationship, but he's been so available to me as an adult with his time, but also with his emotions, and has modeled for me, what it looks like to be contrite, to, feel things, to reflect on things, to admit when you're wrong, to have regrets, and just to be honest. And not in like a fawning way of like I'm the worst and your mother's a saint and I did everything wrong and she did everything right, but just in a very thoughtful, patient, considered way. And so me and my dad have had so many conversations leading up to the interviews that I did for this book. I still learned a lot about his childhood and his teenage years and his 20s. But me and my mom, there's a lot of love there and we talk a lot, but our connection has always been like talking politics, talking economics, and we bond over those things, but it's like, talk like if a father and son just talked about sports, there's the bonding there, but you're not really like getting to the heart of, your experiences and your relationship. And I my mom was in emergency mode for so many years that I think in order to survive, she kind of had to like calcify a lot of her heart and just push forward, get shit done, show up for school, show up for work, and like keep moving. And I think for her, she was afraid like if she did stop and feel things and talk about things, like she would just fall to pieces. And she did have a few moments of falling to pieces because that I mean anyone who knows anything about mental health is like these things don't stay buried forever. Like as much as you try to push things down, like it comes out in other ways. And there was a lot that had remained unspoken between me and my mom, and a lot of yearning on my part for catharsis that I think to some extent has always eluded us, and not for a lack of trying between us. And it was something that I wanted to like unpack in the book, but not leave unresolved. but then still be honest about it, if that makes sense. Like with this book, I always wanted it to be a little bit messy. I didn't want people to have like these grand, satisfying conclusions to these relationships and these emotions. Like I wanted to be honest about how there are moments of catharsis, but the pain is still with you. And even if you break through in your relationship with someone, those challenges can rise back up very quickly. And so I have nothing but love and compassion for my mom, but I don't think there was that bond that me and my dad acquired as adults. I wasn't really that close with either of them as a child. I think they both just had too much going on. And so our like parent-child dynamic has always been fraught. But our, two adults talking and connecting, I think that's grown a lot. And yeah, I still just love my mom to pieces and hope readers do as well.
Absolutely. And I'm going to talk directly to Josiah's parents. If you all are somehow watching this interview, he did an unbelievable job portraying you two, and I want to give him all the credit in the world. So if somehow you're watching this, please know that your son did an amazing job. But there was a phrase that my therapist actually told me a while back that kept coming up for me. And I wanted to mention it to you because I felt like it was a theme throughout a lot of the book. And it's a phrase that I've told other people, and it's kind of caught them off guard sometimes. She told me it was a Spanish phrase, but she translated it for me. And she said that when we are owed a debt, we tend not to seek out the person who owes us, but the person who will pay us.
Mm.
And I felt like that dynamic played out a lot in your book, a lot of misplaced aggression. Or maybe perhaps that old painting of the boss yelling at the dad yelling at the mom yelling at the kid, and the kid yelling at the cat. That type of situation. And it felt like I don't recall any pets being brought up, so I think you were kind of at the bottom of that hill for many, many years of misplaced aggression. And then later on, as an adult, it seemed to also play out that, that dynamic continued to a certain extent, that you would find comfort from each parent or from whoever you were talking to, however you could. I don't know. I just wanted to bring that up to you because it was something that continually rung out to me throughout the entire text.
Yeah, and I think both of my parents were playing out their childhood experiences in their marriage, and what they didn't get from their parents and their siblings, and passed it along, and that continued with their relationship with me and with my relationship with my siblings. And I know that that's played out in my relationships with others as an adult. And there's a family therapist, Terry Harrison, who has some quote, I think I put it in the book, where he talks about these things going from generation to generation until someone has the courage to turn and face that fire that's been blazing. And that, I don't have kids, but in a lot of cases, like when you don't pass that along to your kids, you're kind of putting a stop to that chain reaction from person to person. And that's been a goal of mine. I've been in therapy a long time. I had a therapy session earlier today. I'm twice a week. And, like I said, I don't have kids, but I want to live that out in my friendships, in my partnerships, and anyone that I interact with, that I'm not like trying to meet that hole from my childhood in another person. Like, be my mother to me, be my dad, be my big brother, please. And there've been many times in my adult life where I've realized like, oh, I'm doing that. Like I often like have these relationships with like these friendships with men that are like 5 to 10 years older than me, that aren't like father figures but are like big brother figures. And I'll find myself being like, guide me, love me, like be my big brother that, cares about me. And then realizing what I'm doing and being like, that wound is not going to be healed in this relationship. Like that's on you.
And it's good that you recognize it. And again, I do want to take a moment here though, because through all of the fraught familial relationships that are healing and processing, there was one that seemed to be very pure and very just very wholesome every time it was mentioned. So I want to give a little platform to this individual. Can you tell us a little bit about your grandmother?
My grandmother on my mother's side, I think this is true with a lot of grandparents that they're very different in how they raise their grandchildren than how they had raised their children, because apparently this person was nothing like what my mother grew up with. But for me, I think I have the ability to like love people and be sensitive because of her. Like she gave me that space to just be a sensitive, creative, a little effeminate boy. Like she was fine with me playing with mermaids in the bathtub and wanting to brush their hair or wanting to wear frilly socks. Or dance around, be creative, work with crafts. Like, I never heard from her like boys don't do that. That's a girl's thing. And you should be playing with guns. Like she actually didn't allow us to play with guns. Even squirt guns weren't allowed in our house. She was a progressive Methodist Democrat, which was a long tradition. Loved Jimmy Carter, and saw her Christianity as caring for people, the social gospel. Like a lot of evangelicals view their identity as converting people, getting them saved, getting them into church. Like people who practice the social gospel view their Christianity as caring for the weakest among you, the people who are in prisons and hospitals, neglected children. And her house was always full of kids. And she had so much love and so much transparency where there was a lot of emotional barrier between me and my parents. For her, it was like all there on the surface, like not only in her face and in her body, the way she would hug me, but she would say, I love you, Josiah, like just as you are. And she was my close friend up until, she died. I think in like 2020, and I spoke at her funeral, and I didn't want to. I was very nervous, but I felt the obligation to tell all these people like how much she meant to me. And I was in a long line of other grandkids who were saying the exact same thing, that as teens and adults, we all called her on the phone just to hear her voice, but also like to feel the warmth of her, to feel the like uncomplicated acceptance that she offered people. And I shudder to think what I would be as an adult today if she wasn't in my life. I wouldn't be a writer. She encouraged me in that. She encouraged me in reading. I wouldn't be um, okay with my sensitivity. I wouldn't be okay with my vulnerability, like being open with other people. I'd probably be in prison. I would think. Like I shudder to think why, like what would lead me there, but I think like yeah, something really awful would have transpired for my life if I didn't have that presence at such a crucial age. And also when my parents were going through like all of their madness with fighting and their mental health, my dad's drug addiction and my mom's dissociation, like we went to her house. We would stay for the weekend or a week. And it was such a refuge, like when I do meditation now, like I've done EMDR therapy as well, and they talk about like when things get so overwhelming, picture a place of ultimate safety and love. Like, what is that in your mind? What is like some people have a fictional idea of like a beach or something, or hanging out with like mythical characters. Like I think about my grandma's house. I think about the sound of her voice saying my name as I'm walking through the door. Like, I don't think anything has made me happier than my grandma saying my name.
And I'm glad to just give you a chance to talk about that as someone who is mourning his own grandmother even a year out and had similar feelings. This, I want you to know, listening to you talk about her, not only now, but in the book, was incredible. And I didn't grow up this way at all, but I had some of those feelings of that ultimate acceptance. And I was accepted, I was blessed to be accepted by most of my family, but even beyond that, like your grandmother, I experienced that too, of someone who had been through so much of life and had seen everything that there was to see, it almost felt like, and really accepted the grandkids in particular on their terms rather than trying to put them in a box. I think that's ironic, and we're getting close to the end of this interview, so I'm going to try and lighten it up a tiny bit. But I do think it's interesting that it tends to be those folks in our life or those influences. Ironically, these older folks, or maybe even the little more straight-laced but non-judgmental people, that allow us to see all of these different influences and the absurdities for what they are, you know? I'm not saying your grandmother introduced you to horror movies, but she probably was the one who gave you the presence of self to be like, I'm gonna explore this part of my interests, and made it a little easier.
MTV in her case, like she had cable. My home didn't have cable, and I, you know, watching Paul Abdul, Madonna in excess at her house and dancing around to it. That was like my blossoming as a dandy.
And see, this is what I want to talk about, because when you're talking about you blossoming as a dandy in the context of all of this, one thing I kept coming back to, and I just want to ask your feelings about it, because I know how I feel, but would you be willing to call some of the more outlandish elements of the Christianity you grew up with? It almost felt kind of campy to me at times. That was the phrase I kept going back to, was campy. I was like, some of this is, there are moments of this book that are Stephen King. There are also moments of this book that are John Waters, or even perhaps a Christopher Guest, in some of the more delightfully absurd but less, again, harrowing or haunting parts. Would you think, and again, you were talking about Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames throughout the book, and I remember writing in my notes, I'm looking at it right now, that I said, this is just John Waters. And do you think that's a fair estimation of some of this, or am I way off base?
I think that is fair. I hadn't really thought of it that way before, but I think you're absolutely right. And there were always like I would suspect gay men involved in a lot of like children's church and youth group. Sometimes, I mean, I know where everyone's mind is going, like that there's insidious aspects of that, like working with children. But a lot of them were just characters, people that were just so excited about this play that we're going to put on, and it's going to be absolutely fabulous. And, you know, the dialogue that they write for us was just so over the top and so ridiculous, but we were all so serious about it. You know, think of Christopher Guest, I think of Waiting for Guffman.
I was just about to say, I'm like, you're just describing the plot of Waiting for Guffman.
Right, exactly. And there were a lot of characters just like Christopher Guest in that movie that when you're a kid, like those guys mean the world to you. Like it wasn't all like there. We talked before when you guys were visiting about Jesus Camp, the documentary, which remains one of my favorite documentaries of all time. And you know, the lady who hosted that camp, Becky, is it Becky Fisher? I don't remember, but
that sounds right.
She was a little bit more abusive and insidious in a lot of her presentations.
I sense in my heart tonight what I heard the Lord say is that there's some kids here that say they're Christians, that go to church all the time, but you're one thing when you're at church and you're another thing when you're at school with your friends. You're a phony and a hypocrite. You do things you shouldn't do. You talk dirty just like all the other kids talk dirty. And it's time to clean up your act.
She did have all of these props and like was always coming up with graphics that were like more and more outlandish. Like
she loved her blood font, as I recall.
Yeah.
Whenever she typed scary stuff, she liked to put it in the drippy blood font.
Right. And they would find creative ways to translate these ancient, Jewish fairy tales into something accessible for a modern audience in the most delightful way. That looking back on it, I think those are the things that my family, my community would be embarrassed about today. And you or I, and I'm sure a lot of viewers of the show would find just delightfully charming. And I encountered that so often when I was researching this book and doing interviews with people, and they're like, "You're not going to make us look like rednecks, are you? You're not going to make us look like idiots." And I'm like, well, everything that you're thinking about, that you'd be portrayed in a way that you're uncomfortable with, I think is fantastic about the way I grew up and the goofy stuff that we participated in. And that includes the Pentecostal rituals. Like people often think that that's the insidious part of my childhood, or that's the traumatic part of my childhood, where we're shaking and jumping up and down and shouting this gibberish called speaking in tongues. But those were actually the most cathartic and creative and truthful experiences of my childhood. Just being a big old weirdo, literally sprinting around the church, sometimes skipping or, going down and doing a somersault on the ground. Like you were all just free to be like the biggest freak imaginable. And I kind of yearn for that.
That leads really well into what is going to be my last question for the evening. And it's a question I ask basically everyone who comes on, but I don't know if I've ever been this excited to ask it. And I say it because, again, we're talking to not only the author of one of the most rich, incredible deconstruction tour de forces I've ever read. But we're talking to someone as well with an incredible creative background. We didn't even have time to get into all of your journalistic work and your other books. I didn't even mention it. He's written horror books, like actual horror books. And the fact that, you're the at least in my eyes, you're the man who exposed Michael Tate. You are so many things, and all of them are influenced and informed by this unique background, this unique life that you've lived, and the processing you've done to get to where you are today. And I say this because I think that I always say that people reading these books, especially folks who are in the middle of deconstructing or just starting that journey, sometimes I think these books are going to be hard to read. Yours in particular, I think for some folks will be sending some chills down people's spines, will be keeping a few people up at night in a good way, in a healing way, but in a very direct way. And I say all of that to ask, to those people who are either watching this interview or hopefully reading your book or listening to your book after watching this interview, what advice do you have for them about the journey that you've been on, that they are on, the people who want to be where you are, the people who want to be like you, who want to be on the other side of this trauma and have something to say about it and something to claim from it? What advice would you have for those people?
Oh, that's a heady question. Because I've always had this resistance to being any kind of a role model or leader. And I talk about that a little bit in the book, like that I I I don't have a lot of satisfying takeaways from this. I mean, I can talk about my experience and what worked for me. And, like I was saying before, like I don't have a lot of ideologies or grounded worldview, but I've got a few things that I cling to, like compassion and curiosity. But an additional one is playfulness. Um, you know, and this has become somewhat of a controversial topic, like empathy is. Pete Hegseth was very upset about some policy in the spiritual manual of the U.S. military. I don't know if I'm phrasing that right, but
It was the chaplain's guide, and
yes.
it mentioned playfulness too much, but didn't mention God enough. That was his
Right.
complaint.
To me, playfulness is ultimate spirituality. And from a neurological standpoint, it lights up the brain like nothing else. And playfulness can be defined by something where the act itself is more important than the end result. Like you're not doing something like I love to go running, but I don't like document my running. I don't know what pace I was at or how long I went. I'm not putting it on Strava. I'm not like trying to compete with anyone. I don't really give a shit about the numbers. I want to go out there and I eat some cannabis edibles and put on some really loud Norwegian death metal and just go, you know, jig around in the park. And I think finding your own arena of playfulness is so cathartic, and you discover things in that. You're that's what improv is ultimately, the comedic medium of improv, like or freestyle rapping. You're not like thinking about it beforehand and planning something out and strategizing. You're lost in the moment, and you're being silly and stupid and sometimes unattractive, and it doesn't matter. Like you don't need to put any kind of weight on it. I was writing for probably like 8 years before I ever showed anybody my writing. I never even thought to do that, let alone like try to get published. I just wanted to come home from work at the Winnebago factory and dance around a bit with some sentences and it was amazing to be like, I could just make shit up and, like create these whole vivid worlds where anything can happen that I want to happen. And I found that with dancing and with running and with fashion and decorating a home. Like there's all these arenas where I think a lot of people get caught up in like, feeling self-conscious and not being good at something, which you never are, especially when you're first starting it out. Like, but if you can just get those voices out of your head, get those other people out of your, line of sight and get like myopically tuned into playfulness in whatever arena you can find. Um, there's all kinds of treasures to be unearthed in that medium.
I can't think of a better place to end because I feel like if we keep talking, we're going to override the magic of what Josiah just told us all. So I'm just going to say once again, I'm going to start off by saying, On Fire for God. Josiah, can you tell us when it's coming out, where people can get it, all of the logistics?
Yeah. It'll be out January 13th, and we'll be having a lot of events. Well, two events in Denver, and then I'm going on a book tour through Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and then going through Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. I'll be in New York in March, doing some more Colorado dates when I get back, and I'll be in Nashville in the fall. I can be found on Instagram at JoJoDancer3000. And I'm on Twitter at Josiah M. Hesse. Uh, and I got a website, josiahhesse.com. You can send me messages through there.
Excellent. I know we've used the website josiahhesse.com as kind of our main hub for all of the stuff you're doing. So if you want my recommendation, if you really want to, not in a creepy way, but if you want to follow Josiah's work, that would be where I would direct all of you. And in the meantime, as I always say, I cannot encourage all of you to read this book anymore. It's so good. Again, I know I say this every time, but I mean it every time, and I mean it particularly here. Everyone who reads this will find something meaningful in it. Whether you grew up the way Josiah did, whether you grew up distance from that world the way I did, there will be something here for you to learn, something for you to connect with, and something that will leave you screaming And I mean screaming in every possible capacity. Pick up a copy at your local bookstore, go to your library and request a copy so that other people can get it even if they don't have money. And if you got some time, go check out Josiah's voices in the audiobook. But other than that, Josiah, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with me. It has been a pleasure to read your book. It has been a pleasure to meet with you and speak with you.
Thank you, James. This has been a fantastic conversation. And might I hand it back to you? It's been an honor because I'm such a big fan of Fundy Fridays. When I'm cleaning around the house, when I'm wiping things down and vacuuming, I've got Fundy Fridays playing on the TV.
This is
It's fantastic.
This is the type of stuff that keeps us going. I hope you know. This is when you're 12 hours deep into editing, that's the type of phrase you remember. I'm like, no, Josiah said he would. I'm serious. That's what I just said. Thank you so much. And likewise, thank you to all of you watching. We will, until next time, I suppose, we will see you all very, very soon. And likewise, thank you to all of you so much for joining us for this conversation. I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope you all join us next time here on Fundy Fridays. And we're out. Okay.
Awesome.